I'll share this first with my fellow colleague, Zera Bremont, this session. And Rodrigo, and Rodrigo will discuss too. So yeah, we don't know the roles. Okay, so the title of this session 18th is Reparation and Restitution. We have 5 presentations, and we'll start with Mélanie Denner. Will present on le droit des victimes autochtones à la restitution territoriale en Colombie. Okay. So you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Oh, ok. Bien, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci beaucoup aux organisateurs pour avoir sélectionné cette opportunité de partager avec vous mes projets. J'ai intitulé, le titre a un peu changé en ce moment. Le droit des victimes ethniques à la restitution territoriale en Colombie. Une question de temps, parce que j'avais prévu un paper d'une dizaine de pages, je vais lire. C'est un peu désagréable, mais comme ça, je pense que je vais respecter les temps. Dans le contexte particulier de la Colombie, la restitution territoriale aux peuples autochtones et communautés noires afrodescendantes engage 2 cadres juridiques distincts et complémentaires, la justice transitionnelle et le multiculturalisme. Simplement, c'est comme ça que je l'ai analysé dans ma thèse. En tant que pays, d'une part, traversé par un conflit armé interne, dont il est difficile de parler au singulier et qui dure encore, la Colombie a adopté un ensemble de normes dites transitionnelles visant la démobilisation des acteurs armés, d'une part, et l'accès des victimes à la justice, à la vérité et aux garanties de non-répétition. En particulier le droit des victimes aux réparations dont il est question aujourd'hui. En tant que pays anciennement colonisé et riche d'une grande diversité de cultures et de groupes ethniques, la Colombie s'est progressivement convertie au multiculturalisme, notamment à travers la Constitution de 1991 qui reconnaît le caractère multiculturel et pluriethnique de sa nation. Donc, il ne s'agit pas d'une constitution plurinationale, mais d'une constitution multiculturaliste. Dans les 2 cas, la répartition de la terre et des territoires s'est érigée en problématique majeure des relations ethniques de pouvoir dans la guerre et dans la construction de la paix, et ce, depuis la colonisation. Donc, je propose ici d'analyser un des mécanismes de justice transitionnelle qui s'inscrit dans ce cadre multiculturaliste, les réparations aux victimes autochtones et afro-colombiennes par restitution de terres et de territoires violentés par la guerre, par les violences du conflit armé. Afin de situer un peu les savoirs que j'entends ici restituer avec vous et pour contextualiser un peu le cadre de mes recherches, je vais tout d'abord me présenter la construction de mes objets d'études ainsi que la méthodologie employée. Puis je développerai ma question de recherche en donnant une définition de concept opératoire avant de détailler quelques-uns des résultats observés sur le terrain et ouvrir ensemble des pistes de réflexion pour penser des réparations par restitution territoriale en harmonie avec les demandes politiques et cosmovision des peuples autochtones et afro-colombiens, telles que formulées depuis la région du Cauca, qui est mon terrain d'étude. Donc brièvement, cette présentation s'appuie sur une enquête de terrain que j'ai pu mener dans le département du Cauca de 2018 à 2020, dans le cadre de ma thèse de doctorat, donc qui est inscrite en sciences politiques, et qui porte sur, de façon plus générale, les réparations collectives comme dispositif multiculturel de justice transitionnelle, c'est-à-dire comme mécanisme de construction de la paix par réparation aux victimes membres de peuples ethniques. J'ai employé une méthodologie socio-anthropologique de terrain avec une perspective comparatiste entre 2 processus de réparation collective menés dans le département du Cauca. Donc, au cours de cette recherche, j'ai pu suivre 3 des institutions transitionnelles nées de la loi de 2011, dite loi des victimes et de restitution des terres, et des décrets-lois qu'on appelait les décrets-lois ethniques de décembre de la même année, en m'intéressant plus particulièrement à 2 communautés ethniques reconnues par le sujet collectif de droit à la réparation au titre du conflit armé, mais aussi en tant que peuple ethnique afro-colombien pour l'un et autochtone pour l'autre. Donc, en ce qui concerne les institutions transitionnelles, je me suis rapprochée du Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica, du Centre de mémoire historique en charge des réparations symboliques, mémorielles, du Bureau des victimes de la UARIV, de Unidad de Atención y Reparación Integral a Víctimas, située à Popayán, capitale du Cauca, et pour ce qui fera la présentation aujourd'hui du Bureau de restitution des terres, Unidad de Restitución de Tierras, du département du Cauca. Les deux communautés dont j'ai pu suivre une partie de leur processus de réparation suite aux violences du conflit armé concernent d'une part un resguardo nasa, nommé Kitakiwe, qui en Nasa-Diwe, en langue nasa, veut dire les terres florissantes, qui regroupe en fait une partie un groupe de survivants d'un massacre paramilitaire qui a eu lieu en 2001 dans la région du Naya et qui donc ont obtenu réparation par relocalisation et qui se sont réétablis en tant que resguardo nasa sur de nouvelles terres depuis 2004. Et la deuxième communauté, donc située sur la côte pacifique du même département, il s'agit d'un conseil communautaire afro-colombien qui est en fait formé par 11 communautés noires de la région Pacifique et qui également a connu plusieurs formes de violences liées au conflit armé, principalement en lien avec l'extraction minière légale et illégale, et qui s'est constitué et a été reconnu en tant que conseil communautaire depuis 2001. Dans les deux cas, pour ce qui nous intéresse aujourd'hui, bien que les trajectoires historiques, ethniques et politiques de ces deux communautés recouvrent de nombreuses différences, il s'agit pour ces deux communautés de communautés rurales, situées en périphérie des centres de pouvoir politique et économique, où toutes deux adoptaient des figures politico-territoriales marquant leurs appartenances ethniques au peuple afro-colombien pour l'un et au peuple nasa pour l'autre. Un autre point de ressemblance est que ces deux territoires collectifs sont situés dans le département du Cauca, qui est en soi un territoire périphérique du système monde moderne colonial capitaliste, qui a été marqué par différentes formes de violences historiques et contemporaines, et qui durent encore, ayant connu tout type de groupes armés dans le cadre du conflit armé, donc groupes de guérilla, paramilitaires, et également exactions de l'armée nationale. Dans un cas, on a affaire à une économie d'enclave, principalement donc sur la côte pacifique, le conseil communautaire de Reparation Negro, principalement tourné autour de l'extraction de l'or, et dans l'autre, une économie paysanne en cours de revitalisation des sols, qui auparavant était dédiée à la monoculture de pin et d'eucalyptus. Une grande différence s'impose et est nécessaire de préciser, alors que Kitakiwe, donc le resguardo nasa, regroupe une soixantaine de familles sur 200 hectares, donc véritablement une finca en fait. Reparation Negro s'étend sur 71 000 hectares et regroupe plus de 700 familles, 761 selon le recensement qui est contesté en fait. Et donc pour ce qui nous intéresse ici, il s'agit de deux communautés ethniques qui se reconnaissent et sont reconnues par l'État comme sujets collectifs de droit à la réparation. Et donc, ils font l'objet d'une protection spécifique en tant que peuple ethnique et jouissent de droits individuels et collectifs, comme la propriété collective du territoire, mais aussi une certaine autonomie politique et territoriale et la reconnaissance de leurs différences ethniques et culturelles dans la mise en œuvre des politiques qui les concernent, à commencer par les politiques de réparation. Donc, depuis 2011, dans le cadre de la loi 1448, dite de victimes et restitution des terres, et de ses décrets-lois 4633 et 4635, ils sont reconnus comme sujet ethnique de droit à la réparation et à une réparation différentielle ethnique. Donc, ils sont rentrés par des voies différentes d'accès à ces droits. Reparation Negro a obtenu en 2015 et commencé son processus en 2011, mais en 2015, a obtenu une décision judiciaire de restitution de droits territoriaux de par le tribunal des terres de Popayan. Et dans le cas de Kitakiwe, qui a une trajectoire plus longue de réparation par le bas, depuis 2001, depuis leur premier déplacement suite au massacre paramilitaire, et a obtenu réparation en 2004 par relocalisation, donc sur un nouveau territoire, des terres florissantes, qu'il s'agit d'enfants. Donc, dans cette communication, je vais me concentrer sur les enjeux spécifiques des réparations territoriales au peuple ethnique et en particulier sur la relation qui se tisse entre les autorités ethniques qui vont représenter ces communautés et les institutions transitionnelles. Donc, je vais de me concentrer sur en fait, les relations qui se tissent entre autorités transitionnelles et autorités ethniques, et de voir à trois échelles d'analyse, donc à l'échelle nationale, de voir comment se forment ce croisement entre droits des victimes et droits des peuples autochtones et afro-colombiens à travers les lois, comme résultat de lutte ethnique pour être intégrés comme victimes spécifiques du conflit armé. À l'échelle départementale, de voir comment est-ce que les fonctionnaires transitionnels interprètent ces lois et comment est-ce qu'ils projettent leur interprétation des normes législatives sur leur façon de travailler avec les communautés ethniques. Et sur un troisième plan, dans une approche comparatiste, de comparer les deux processus à l'échelle communautaire locale. Donc, puisqu'il me reste 2 minutes, je vais directement passer aux conclusions. Donc voilà, j'ai pas le temps de développer dans le détail les 3 échelles d'analyse, mais on pourra peut-être y revenir dans la discussion. Mais on va développer 3 éléments d'analyse principaux dans cette articulation qui naît entre la catégorie citoyenne de victimes et la citoyenneté ethnique partagée entre communautés afro-colombiennes et autochtones. Une première de ces conclusions, c'est que en comparant ces 2 cas, malgré de grandes difficultés de mise en œuvre véritable des réparations, que cela prenne la forme de restitution de droits territoriaux ou de relocalisation territoriale, la formulation de ces politiques, dans un premier temps, permet de légitimer les autorités traditionnelles ethniques comme interlocuteurs légitimes de l'État, et afin de elles-mêmes définissent en fait les limites de leur territoire, donc de dessiner le cadastre national à partir de l'histoire orale du territoire et pas des cartes officielles qui souvent soit sont erronées, soit se superposent et créent des conflits interculturels ou interethniques. Donc une redéfinition du cadastre à partir de cette histoire orale du territoire, et ces échanges, ces espaces interculturels de formulation des politiques de réparation permet d'expliciter leur propre vision du territoire et des frontières aux représentants de l'État qui souvent se retrouvent démunis face à la formulation de politiques adéquates, et leur permettent d'expliquer en fait et de formuler collectivement qu'est-ce qui pourrait être des réparations historiques justes via un dialogue interculturel participatif. Les restitutions territoriales encouragent. Ça encourage également dans ce processus de formulation l'émergence de leaders ethniques qui vont représenter les communautés de victimes, qui sont mobilisés autour de la défense du territoire et des usages non hégémoniques de la terre et du vivant. Ça permet donc en ce sens d'amorcer un dialogue de savoir qui ne demande qu'à dépasser la reconnaissance pour aller vers une redistribution. Et c'est tout l'enjeu un peu des politiques de reconnaissance de la différence ethnique et culturelle, c'est justement d'aller au-delà de simplement une reconnaissance sur le papier, mais une véritable redistribution des ressources et aussi des postes publics en fait. Donc cette redistribution des terres qui va au croisement entre les citoyennetés de victimes et citoyennetés de peuples ethniques questionne cette accumulation des ressources foncières qui a été exacerbée par le conflit armé, mais qui date depuis la colonisation, et cette accumulation aussi en fait des postes de la fonction publique en charge de la transition vers la paix. L'ouverture plus récente de ces agences transitionnelles à différents groupes ethniques en tant que fonctionnaires, ce que l'on observe plus récemment, est à même de faciliter un véritable dialogue interculturel et la compréhension plurielle du territoire. Et une des barrières que j'ai pu observer dans mes entretiens menés auprès des fonctionnaires transitionnels, véritablement l'incompréhension en fait d'appliquer un droit qui s'il fait la différence entre la restitution de terres aux paysans et la restitution de droits territoriaux aux communautés ethniques, dans le sens où il s'agit de restaurer une relation, un lien au territoire plus qu'un bout de territoire, cette incompréhension peut être résorbée en ouvrant les postes publics à une diversité ethnique et qui ne soient pas accaparés en fait par des fonctionnaires de la ville et exclusivement presque blancs métis. Deuxième conclusion, j'essaye d'aller rapidement, ces interactions interinstitutionnelles que j'ai pu observer sur ces 2 territoires dévoilent des incompréhensions mutuelles et des projections ethnicistes de la part des fonctionnaires qui, en fait, à travers leur travail, tendent à homogénéiser la catégorie citoyenne de communautés ethniques. Et donc, en fait, font circuler des pratiques tenues pour ancestrales et les reproduisent d'une communauté à l'autre, sachant que leur public cible de politique publique, en fait, recouvre une centaine de peuples autochtones, une diversité de communautés noires, afro-colombiennes, raizales et palenqueras, qui, en fait, ont des traditions extrêmement distinctes les unes des autres, mais sont regroupées dans cette catégorie homogénéisante de citoyenneté ethnique. Donc, c'est toute la difficulté rencontrée. Et une troisième et dernière conclusion qu'on peut pointer concerne les processus de restitution territoriale qui, pour voir les choses de façon un peu plus positive et engageante, peuvent constituer un tremplin pour penser le multiculturalisme, donc au-delà de ces catégories socio-juridiques établies par le droit, et en faisant lumière sur des conceptions ethniquement différenciées de notions telles que le territoire, la frontière, la sécurité, l'espace territorialisé et les formes autonomes de gestion de ces frontières, notamment avec le passage dans le droit de la reconnaissance des guardias indígenas y cimarronas comme forme d'autoprotection distincte de la question de la sécurité qui serait de la responsabilité de l'armée ou de la police. La reconnaissance du territoire comme victime est un pas vers l'énonciation du... C'est ma dernière phrase. C'est un pas vers l'énonciation du droit d'autorité à autorité et de rapport de force qui s'incarne dans de nouveaux espaces transitionnels, avec une approche collective de la justice transitionnelle et l'obtention de droits spécifiques et collectifs en des termes multiculturalistes qui constituent tout à la fois une structure d'opportunité et de contrainte pour penser des réparations historiques via une répartition plus juste de la terre, enjeu majeur et historique de la guerre et de la paix envers les peuples autochtones et afro-colombiens. Et merci beaucoup de m'avoir laissé un peu plus.
Pour cette présentation, Mélanie, et ça fera le lien aussi avec Clément qui s'est intégré à notre session de manière très aimable, étant donné qu'il n'y avait pas grand monde dans cette session, et bon, ça fera le lien sur le territoire, la participation urbaine et les différentes notions que tu as évoquées. Je suis sûr qu'on pourra avoir une très bonne discussion. Donc maintenant, so I'll give the floor to Sarah and Leocadia. Yeah.
Leocadia
is online.
She's going to start.
Okay, perfect. For a presentation entitled The Coloniality of Extractivism in Land and Culture Challenging Germany's Post-Colonial Violence Through Collective Rights. So you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will start and share a little presentation. And I hope you can see it.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm very happy to present our paper on the coloniality of extractivism in land and culture, challenging Germany's post-colonial violence through human rights. Through collective rights. And this is a paper authored by myself, Leocadia Mecher, and my co-author, Sarah Imani, and we are both German lawyers working on German and European colonial crimes, reparations, and restitution, as well as critical and decolonial perspectives on the law. And I will introduce you to the main arguments of our paper, and Sarah will then take over with some concluding remarks on our thesis. And we are we're looking forward to your questions and to workshop our thoughts together. Our paper focuses on two cases that exemplify the colonial and post-colonial extractivist violence of Germany. And we want to show how in the historic extraction of cultural resources and in the current and future extraction of natural resources, colonial patterns of commodification and denial of legal subjectivity arise in a trans-temporal sense. And we want to investigate if and how these patterns of extractivist legal violence can be countered through a decolonial application of human rights, drawing on methodologies and scholarship such as the Third World approaches to international law 12 or the critical race theory and racial capitalism. Applying these to the cases makes us ask the question of why and how we can counter this coloniality with rights, especially those types of rights that foreground the ongoingness of colonial harm and the lived experiences of the affected indigenous communities. Let's first talk about the example of colonial looting. during the colonization of so-called Cameroon. The colonial occupation of Cameroon in the late 1900s until the 1990s by Germany came with a massive extraction of cultural heritage. Researchers just estimated last year that more than 40,000 entities from Cameroon still remain in public collections in Germany. And one concrete example of colonial looting are the takings of the Bangwa cultural heritage. You can see here, like the famous Bangwa queen on the right, still held actually in a collection in Paris, and the other sacred Lefem figures as exemplified by on the left. And the Lefem are considered the heartbeat of Bangwa spirituality and cultural identity, which is accessible only to initiated persons. Nevertheless, in those colonial times, they were taken by German colonial agent called Gustav Konrau, and he took it to Berlin to the ethnological museum, the so-called Völkerkunde Museum. And I want to highlight a few points regarding colonial lootings like these. First, the colonial extractivist violence was carried out in the name of science. The cultural heritage as well as human remains were taken to the metropolis for pseudo-scientific quests of research. And they were part of the broader project of racial science and chasing the mirage of proving white supremacy and the supremacy of the so-called civilized world. Another colonial dynamic that shaped the looting is the commodification of cultural heritage. Often communities of origin see these cultural belongings as entities with agency, but through the act of taking, they were commodified as marketable art and objects on which the colonizers imposed concepts like property and ownership. And this shows up in historic and present accounts of the looting, some claiming that the Bangwa Lefem were gifts of the Bangwa chief, Fontem Asungani, you can see here, to Konrau, which again prescribes Western concepts of property that don't fit the spiritual meaning of the Lefem. And this has to be seen also in the larger context of violence and power imbalance. This is also apparent in the context of colonial contracts that were pushed by the Germans, especially so-called Schutzverträge or protection contracts, through which the colonizers tried to legalize their claim on the territories. They show the ambivalent dynamic of difference these legal processes try to establish, recognizing the legal subjectivity of the colonized in one moment, and then fully negating them as an equal holder of rights and sovereignty in practice. And here it is important to point out that on the German side, these contracts, which officially established the colonial territories, were not negotiated and signed by German state officials, but rather by German businessmen that were active in the region. To this day, most of the Bangwa Lefem remain in the museums and institutions of the former colonizer, despite their distinctive demands of descendants and Bangwa representatives like Chief Charles Taku or activist Sylvie Nyobati to finally give back. And the efforts by the state institutions in Germany have starting to take shape, but they still remain timid. Let's move on to our other example, the natural resource extractivism in the present. The colonial continuity and relationships of coloniality manifest themselves the most in the current day at another side of contention, the climate crisis. One effort to counter the climate crisis are green energy projects. And one such project is the largest hydrogen project in sub-Saharan Africa, pushed forward in Namibia through a joint venture called Hyphen. And Hyphen, the venture plans to build a plant that produces green hydrogen to transport to Europe, especially to Germany. And the Namibian Hyphen company is largely owned by a German sustainable energy company called Enertrag. It's a very big project with an investment size of nearly 10 billion US dollar. So this is about the same size as the Namibian GDP. And the Namibian government is on board, and through a bidding process, the company gained concessions on the land. So at first glance, this is a positive for sustainable energy and the Namibian economy, but through a decolonial human rights lens, some more aspects stand out, especially the location of the hydrogen plant, which is close to the city of Lüderitz in Namibia. And you can see here on the upper picture that the Shark Island, which is part of Lüderitz, was one side of the genocide of the Ovaherero and Nama people in the beginning of the 20th century. And German troops there maintained a camp, actually already called a concentration camp back then, where many people died due to horrendous living conditions, forced labor, poor healthcare conditions, etc. And plans are now to build port facilities for the hydrogen plant at Shark Island. And the plant itself would be located in a national park, which is ancestral land of the Nama and would lead to environmental destruction there. As a result, we have a situation where sites of memory are endangered and evidence of and documentation of colonial crimes might become impossible and forever lost. And also environmental and health damages are looming. For example, harbors have huge pollution and can lead to water shortages. The combination of all of these points out that there is a potential environmental and human endangerment and infringement of collective memory and spaces for healing. Again, I want to stress some main points, as in the case with cultural heritage, the broader narrative of science and scientific progress serves here for this project as a ground of justification. It's also apparent that there's a power imbalance, a dynamic of difference that used to be about land and territory now has switched to climate and to access of resources. And the main temporal element is the negotiation of access to rights still and to remedies, like in the colonial times. Thus, the Hyphen project still holds the colonial continuity of unequal economic allocation, but also of unequal protection by the law. This crystallizes especially in the way contracts are made again here between governments, the government of the post-colonial state and Western corporations without any meaningful participation of the affected communities. The Nama have not been sufficiently consulted in the process, and the respective negotiation processes and outcomes mirror what we have learned from the context of colonial looting and collecting. To summarize, through these green projects, the German population once again can frame and position itself as the civilized, science-based climate defender, while the cost for this position is paid by the same communities German colonizers have killed and exploited during colonial times. So we have seen that one major site of concentration in both the historic colonial looting as well as the resource extraction of the present and future is the use of law and the denied access to justice. And a decolonial analysis and practice of both the role of law as well as the chances in using the law to overcome the coloniality of extraction is needed. While we have to keep in mind that the legal form overall, and especially public international law, historically and into the present, functions to formalize, legitimize, and legalize colonial power. But progressive schools of legal thought, such as Twale, critical race theory, and theories of racial capitalism, offer ample tools on how to reclaim the legal forum. In a decolonizing approach, including law in matters of reparative justice, reparation, restitution, the colonial lens must be flipped. This entails recentering of third world perspectives and understandings of the law, and at the same time, a deconstruction of capitalist legal forms like the legal construct of property and legal standing. And in place of these, we could put a sense of rehumanization and installing legal subjectivity. So a decolonizing approach must center questions of claiming and enforcing human and constitutional rights. However, centering human rights not in a liberal universalist understanding, this must be critically examined. And the challenge is to carve out a decolonial approach to human rights, centering concepts and practices of indigenous rights, collective rights, and cultural rights. So let's look at some rights we can draw on here. Sorry, this is there. I need to get back to my notes. 1 second. Oh, sorry.
Eucaria, I think
But I
you
think
will
that
have to conclude.
Yeah, but I would
No, of course.
so important that she just claims the
Yeah,
law.
I wanted to wait. Can you?
Perfect, thank you. Very tough.
Sorry, it's technical.
Yeah.
So, I don't know where the.
No, normally you can share your screen.
Yeah.
You already shared it, but.
I will try again. Yeah, now here we go. So let's have a quick look at some of the laws we can use regarding the patterns of colonial extractivism. So we can decolonial utilization of human rights reveals the potential within the cultural rights and indigenous rights frameworks, and I will touch upon a few of these rights, how they may serve as a legal basis for claims of restitution in the Bangwa Lefem case, and then bring up some points of how such progressive interpretation of human rights can then be implemented and referenced within transnational legal frameworks, drawing on the hyphen example and the right to a healthy environment, and within emergent supply chain laws. So through international law, some human rights and cultural rights provisions offer the ability to translate the historic colonial harm into a rights violation in the present. I want to highlight here both the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, and the right to culture according to Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the ICESCR. And an intertwined and decolonial reading of these rights will bring us to the recognition that the collective right to culture of communities deprived of their cultural heritage has been continuously violated. And this gross human rights violation leads to a right of reparation and then restitution. I won't go now into every detail of this reading and decolonial interpretation of Article 15, but let me highlight quickly some main points. Article 15 has been more and more interpreted as an umbrella right to culture open to a manifold interpretation of culture, not limited to a falsely universalized global north understanding of culture as objects and art. This has been done, for example, through the general comments of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And regarding the UNDRIP, it offers explicit obligations regarding restitution and participation and representation rights based on the principle of free, prior and informed consent in Article 11 and Article 18. While declared as a non-binding instrument, developments over the last years have shown that they express evolving customary international law and encapsulate a broad understanding of the term indigenous people. This is largely the case as the UNDRIP has become more and more referenced when interpreting the very broad Article 15 of the ICESR, and thus incorporating the UNDRIP obligation into the universally binding ICESCR. And yeah, let me leave it at that. I want to stress only one point, that this is also crucial, that this can be used as a collective right, exercised within a group of people or as a whole community, and not only as an individual liberal right to identity. And then let's have a quick and final look at on how a decolonial reading of emergent transnational norms in supply chain law is combined with the right to a healthy environment can address the post-colonial violence resurfacing in the hydrogen extraction in Namibia. Yeah, since we have since national law produces the strongest legal obligations, this especially in terms of curtailing power of corporations, we wanted to take a look at the German due diligence legislation. And the German Supply Chain Act includes references to international human rights law, as you can see here in section 2. And at the core here lies the difficult task, including human rights law, and in this case, the law and the emerging right to a healthy environment brings with it the difficult task of balancing under this right the legitimate demand for green energy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the rights of the Nama people, for example, to memory and to land. And the right to a healthy environment is a very multifaceted right that finds its substantial ground in various human rights treaties. And it's a right for the protection of the environment, but also entails such provisions as the right to clean air, a safe climate, access to water, sanitation, and food. and to non-toxic environments. And one of the rights protected under this umbrella is again also the right to enjoy cultural rights, the right to participation in cultural life, but can only be achieved in a healthy environment. And pollution, for example, interferes with this indigenous people's right to cultural development, as they rely on their ancestral lands for their cultural practices. When reading this right into Section 2 of the German Supply Chain Act, we of course have to account for the national law's very narrow legislative legacy. But on the other hand, and because of the principle of progressive interpretation in international human rights law, we equally have to account for this when interpreting the law over time and in line with current developments. And against this, the memory work and fight for reparations for the genocide and for the communities of the Nama and Oba Herero are alive and part of their cultural identity as a community and indigenous people. And we need to, the German corporation implementing this project needs to prevent human rights risk from the materialization on these legal grounds. And I will just hand over to my colleague Sarah to wrap up this very quickly. And thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. So then we have the presentation of Nina Silva, titled Territoriality.
It's fine.
Yeah. You're interested.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing, and thank you to all of you for staying and making it on a Friday afternoon. This is very much early ideas and an early draft, so I will try to keep it short because I'm more interested in having your thoughts and feedback on it. And if you don't have time now, if some of you stay for drinks after, I'm more happy to discuss it. So maybe before starting, and I will stick to the time even with this, just to remark. So this is based on the fieldwork I have been conducting with NASA Indigenous people in the north of the Gorkai region during 8 months. And as you will have noticed, the presentation is going to be in English. But I have decided to keep the codes in Spanish out of respect for the person I have been working with, and to try to also honor the voice and not lose the essence in the translation. With that also, I think it's important to have in mind that I am not Indigenous myself. And so I also tried to recall to distinguish when I recall their voice when I'm coming to my own interpretation and reading of it. And also, I think it has been mentioned before, we are going to speak about transitional justice, post-conflict, but as Laetitia was mentioning, it may be better to speak about post-peace agreement and not about post-conflict, because the Gorkai region is still a zone of conflict. And I think it's important to remind that why I'm speaking about this process. Okay, so in Alexis style, but I think this is not going to work with this public. I want to start with asking you, what did you see there? No one does. Mountains, trees.
Peace, end of conference.
That I was not expecting. So yeah, usually when you ask, people will say, well, mountain, tree, nature. But if you ask the Nanda people from the resguardo of Muchique Los Tigres, this is actually the Cerro de Muchique. It's a sacred mountain, it's a living being. You can feel, cry, and it actually has been hurt by the Colombian armed conflict. So, as it was mentioned earlier, and as most of you know, Colombia had an armed conflict for about 56 years until the peace agreement, but again, keeping in mind that in some zones it's keep going on, mostly opposing the FARC, the Colombian government. There is also paramilitaries in other groups. But for this purpose, the FARC put a base camp on the top of the Cerro de Muchique. And there they killed and buried many people. And if you ask the NASA from Muchique Los Tigres, they will tell you it's not only about the killings of the people, the human right violation of killing the people, but it's also about the pats, sucio in Spanish. The dirt will be the literal translation. It is this idea that when you kill someone, the blood goes to Mother Earth and you leave some dirt. And you need to do certain process to take off this earth and really equilibrate the disharmony that has created. Another effect of the armed conflict was, for instance, there was on the top of the Cerro, there was a sacred lagoon whose spirits were regulating the season. But because of the armed conflict, the lagoon is currently hiding herself. And because of that, the seasons are not working normally anymore. The armed group also have been cutting a lot of trees. And they will tell you, well, it's not only that they cut the tree, but also those trees represented some elder of the community. And with the cutting of the tree, we have lost elders and their knowledge. What I want to show by that is those are type of harms that so far have been ignored by transitional justice, but international, generally speaking, human rights. So traditional justice, those mechanisms that deal with past abuses. And so far, the international framework has been built around the idea that victims are so human and that the experience of pain should be located in the experience of human being. Consequently, reparation also have only been designed in anthropocentric matter or ecocentric matter, but always focusing on this opposition between nature and human. And this has led to the exclusion of indigenous knowledge as the experience of the NASA, which consider themselves in more an inter relationship with nature. One cannot exist without the other one. As again, it was mentioned in another presentation in 2016, was signed the peace agreement and then initiated what is known as the transitional justice process. And the peace agreement creates the head that special jurisdiction for peace, Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, that Leticia also mentioned earlier, as the jurisdiction in charge of dealing with the cases related to the armed conflict. 2019, the HEP opened, not 2019, sorry, the HEP opened the micro case 05, who look specifically at all the violations that were committed in the Cauca region, where the Cerro de Muchique is located. And in 2020, and that's what I'm interested in, the court recognized the territory of the Shamwala-Kiwe, a gran territorio NASA de la Shamwala-Kiwe, which includes the Cerro de Muchique, as a victim of the armed conflict. And we have been mentioning that in other presentations already, speaking about right of nature. But it recognizes this idea that for those communities, the territory has also suffered and is a victim as such. And this brings us to the question of, all right, the territory is a victim, it has now its own rights to intervene in the process, and it has its own right to reparation. And so what are going to be the reparation to the territory? We are all waiting for it, but those are my thoughts on this. So in April this year, so last month, the REP issued the first reparative measure sanction propias. Okay, in another case, and it was about replanting. And my point is, those kind of measures are again ecocentric in the sense that it's only about replanting without taking into consideration part, well, the trees was maybe upheld, that some spirit has disappeared because of the armed conflict. And the point I already discussed with you, what I believe is that the action may be the same. At the end, it may be about replanting, because when you speak about relational reparation, it involves the community also. But it will take into consideration first another narrative, and it will go with another process. And so how I see that for me what matters is that indigenous owners, derecho propio, should be the one guiding the process. And if you let the community using their own law, you will be able to identify all those harms, but also have other type of other way of repairing the territory, because you can also not dress an abstract list. And I think this focus on indigenous own laws will also avoid to fall in the trap of having a standardized reparation to the territory based on romanticization and universalization of indigenous cosmogony, because every community has is different relationship with the territory and is different experience of the harm to the territory. I also think, and I will conclude with that, but focusing on the derecho propio will be a way to have what some scholars have called transformative reparation and historical justice, because those systems of justice have often, well, they have been marginalized since the colonization, but also afterward, and have they been particularly affected by the armed conflict because they were not able to perform their rituals, and there was not justice applicable. So I also think it's about strengthening those justice systems, recognize them, engage with them on an equal footing, and that is maybe a first way also to repair. So I will conclude with this. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have Gemma Valona, who will present a paper entitled Restorative Environmental and Interspecies Justice Meeting and Learning with Indigenous Justice. And she's a member of the Basque Institute of Criminology. So I give the affiliation of the other panelists.
Thank you so much. I'm just asking Nina, she's so kind to help me with this. It's right here. So
Yeah, but I need to.
okay.
No,
Thank you so much. So I will use this couple of minutes so I don't create more stress. She's giving me this great gift. Also to say thank you to the organizers, particularly Jessica, who's running from one place to another, Paulo and the others, and also for the kindness of being here this Friday after the talk with you. I'm sorry because you are seeing my back, which for me is quite rude. But well,
First
you have to stop yours.
No, but I already stopped sharing.
Okay. We are seeing it, so
Yeah, but I can't like change on it because now it's the full screen of this. I don't know. Where is it? Attends, on peut enlever ça? Non, 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 ouais. Tu vois, il y a eu quand tu as ça? There?
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. I will go very, very fast. So I start by saying, as a standpoint, knowledge as well. I am not an expert in environmental law. I am not an expert in indigenous communities. So you might be wondering, what is this woman doing here? So just a very quick, I go back to when I presented back in 1994 at the International Institute of the Sociology of Law. That's those pictures. I'm behind by the seas where I live in San Sebastian. Back there, I started my PhD on social control. And I think many of the debates that I'm hearing today and these days, these past debates, have to do with, so we call it law. I think we can call it in sociology of law a much broader notion of social control. Social control that can be more inclusive, can be less violent, and there are wonderful writings on that. I then finished back that year my PhD on restorative justice as a way of social control in relation to criminal justice system. And I compare different cases of restorative justice, what was then called reparative mediation, in the jurisdiction of the criminal justice in Spain, in adults and minors, and also within the Romani community that back then, no one talked of a Romani community. They didn't care. They called themselves gypsies. So that was not a problem in terms of denigration. And this was much more related because restorative justice comes also from an idea of alternatives to prison. And nowadays, more and more, it is sometimes defined as a realistic abolitionism of prisons and perhaps the criminal justice system, which probably is seen by many as utopian. Anyway, taking into account the effects of the current criminal justice system, including the overrepresentation of indigenous communities and ethnic minorities. So there are a lot of readings and a lot of references on carceral feminism, for example, or abolitionist feminism, and not so many about non-carceral indigenism or abolitionist indigenism. So my theoretical framework, you don't need to read all that, is just on the margins, is green criminology and sensory criminology. That's the field where I come from. Green criminology starts in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, even though there are some precedent of that in Latin America, in concrete in Cuba. And green criminology questions the notion of crime. It talks about harms, so it might be under the jurisdiction of administrative law or civil law, but also criminal law. It also questions state power, corporations' power, and so on in that imbalance of relationships. And recently, I'm coming also in relation to anthropology or some methods in anthropology, is sensory criminology with the great, well, I like him very much, an Anglo-Saxon criminologist called Nigel South, collaborate with him. And it's to do with how we research and how we learn with the senses. Well, how all these might relate also, of course, to the idea of indigenous justice. So what I'm trying to do is put into conversation and learning. What I want to say is that I think restorative justice has to learn from indigenous justice. Now, what is indigenous justice is very complicated because there are so many indigenous communities, autochthonous communities, and so on, First Nations. So maybe we should talk about indigenous justice systems. Probably there is not an agreement on this. There is not even an agreement on what is restorative justice. But it's a way perhaps to clear the table and see a little bit, just to share some ideas. So there are some convergence on these three definitions that I will try to explain better. Restorative justice, well, the idea of social control and ways how we respond to conflicts has to do with this idea that maybe we should respond to conflicts in a way that is more participatory, is more peaceful, is less violent. That does not mean impunity. That does not mean, not taking things seriously. So for me, it's important to think about what is the images usually associated with restorative justice. If I say restorative justice, what is the image? What comes to your mind? If I say crime, probably without thinking, what comes to your mind, right? This is the same how we can think. I don't have time to explain this, but we work a lot with collaborative art, and maybe later. This is so to say that restorative justice is born in the I mean, the residents are found in indigenous communities, but in a way of they use alternative dispute resolution, mediation, and so on. But we can find political, religious, and academic writings that are behind that understanding. And of course, more and more we have international standards under what we can call a cuerpo jurídico, we say in Spanish, juridical standards on restorative justice. Most of them at the level of the United Nations, like with transitional justice, they are more soft law, but for example, at the level of, also at the level of the Council of Europe, but at the level of the European Union, we have a legal binding definition under the Statute of the Victim, because restorative justice was born out of the activism of alternatives to prison, out of the activism of human rights activists and professionals in the criminal justice system working with offenders. And it has evolved. I don't have time to explain this, but it's very interesting. It has evolved towards the victims movement that can be manipulated, of course, to be more punitive, but in the sense that victims suffer secondary victimization by the criminal justice system. So you, again, the law, what we do with the law and what the law does with us, what violence does with us and what we can do with violence. So again, all these questions that I think I heard a lot. And of course, we cannot forget that we are talking about the criminal justice system. So the form of the extreme form of social control, because it has the most severe consequences, that is so united with the othering, with creating this social order and excluding people. So just to remind of that. So it can be a lot of networking at the end. 2 minutes. And then again, the peace, I think we cannot understand restorative justice without thinking that it is belong something you can call naive, that is the peace movement. The idea that we want it or not, the criminal justice system is discriminatory, we want it or not, it is a form of, if so, legitimate violence. Okay, I will pass very fast all these. What are the principles of restorative justice? The main principle is that is voluntary participation. If I have to find a difference, we have discussed this many times, between transitional justice and restorative justice, I'd say that restorative justice was first in the sense at the level of international standards, because it was born at the mid-70s. And I'd say that is micropolitics, it's not macropolitics, like transitional justice. And I would say that it is not for a transition. It is not, even though it can take decades, it aims at transforming the criminal justice system. It aims at remaining, not just for a transition, okay? And I mean, the greatest potential is the greatest limitation. It is voluntary. So if corporations don't want to join, they won't join. If the state doesn't want to participate, it won't participate. So then I will just go very, very fast. So there are different encounters of restorative justice with Indigenous. The first encounter is because all the ADR movement with Laura Nader and other anthropologists saying, hey, we can deal with conflicts in a different way. So adjudication is not only the only way. We have other forms, trilateral forms of social control where we can deal with conflicts. And hey, let's value conflicts. What we have to do is to respond. We can learn from conflicts. We can change things from conflicts, but we have to aim at there is no impunity and that there is violence in responding to conflicts. There is a second encounter, and it's when, because of the overrepresentation of indigenous communities, we started using in restorative justice in the 80s, peacemaking cycles of the Maoris and also of some Australian Aboriginals. And well, all that entered into restorative justice. And there is a third encounter when restorative justice said, well, it could be applied also to environmental justice. I think it is much better to talk about ecological and interspecies justice. Now, justice has a problem with this, because restorative justice is always concentrated, has been always concentrated in interpersonal relationships. It says we have to think about crime or harms in a way that is not a violation of an abstract norm, but it's a breakdown of interpersonal relationships of people who might know each other or not in the terms of living together. And so it has to learn from different languages. It has to learn from different ways of seeing. And this is where I think that restorative justice can learn. And in fact, there are a lot of references on this. Now, is this just an assumption? It is this again restorative washing? It is this again somehow of being naive? Is it again a manipulation of the interests of indigenous people? And at the same time, if we take it from an intersectional point of view, we also have to think that there are also conflicts, violent conflicts within the indigenous communities themselves. So this is kind of, I'm finishing. Well, this is the same. This has to do with the legal pluralism. Yeah. Okay, so commonalities, relational definition of harm, participation, harm reparation, and healing, right? But there are tensions in terms of who is participating. If all the vocabulary is constructed with vision of anthropocentrism, and also this vision of healing of human relationships. And then there is an opportunity for facilitators, because we need facilitators of restorative justice, those who engage into a potential encounter, a potential conversation of the harm doer and the harmed ones and the community affected. So I see there an opportunity for indigenous people themselves to be protagonists also of that, being facilitators. But we have to answer a lot of questions. Now, I'm finished, really. What is the practice of this? This is quite new, and the best practice we have right now, we can find it in Australia. In fact, well, I wrote a book if someone wants to. It's in Spanish, but it has also the references in English, and an English scholar is also writing a epilogue in English from Australia. And then there are things going on, for example, with cases that have entered into criminal justice system, but they don't involve indigenous communities, for example, in Spain, because we don't have them. And we use these cycles, well, I don't have time, so I just finish. Thank you so much. This is Procusto, and the idea, let me take a Greek myth, that this is really a torturer, because he used to invite people and say, here you have a bed. But what happened that they didn't fit into the bed. Some were too long, others were too short. What he did was enlarge the people who were too short, cut into pieces the people who were too long. So are we accommodating indigenous knowledge to fit into our Western idea of restorative justice or not? So thank you. I'm sorry for this.
Je vais donner la parole à Clément Moreau, qui est doctorant au Centre de recherche et de documentation sur les Amériques, de l'Université de Sorbonne Nouvelle, et qui va nous parler de sa recherche sur les peuples autochtones en milieu urbain, et plus spécialement en Colombie. Vraiment, vous avez la parole pour 10 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Alors, au final, je ne sais pas si ça vous a été dit, mais Jessica m'a dit que pour des questions de temps, c'était mieux que je participe à 18h dans un autre cadre que dans cette session.
Alors, à 18h, c'est un atelier, donc vous n'aurez pas vraiment l'opportunité de présenter directement votre papier, je pense.
Bah, je sais pas, c'est ce qu'elle m'a dit à 18h au début de la séance de skills, où tout le monde sera là et on pourra commenter le travail avec Pablo et Eza. Donc, je ne sais pas.
Ok, bon, ben, suivons sa décision, étant donné que je ne suis pas décisionnaire dans cette organisation. Je suis vraiment désolé, donc on vous retrouve.
Il n'y a pas de souci, pas de problème.
Rodrigo, te doy la palabra para que puedas discutir entonces la intervención. No sé en qué idioma. Rodrigo. Rodrigo, no te escuchamos, parece que tu micrófono está...
Okay, yeah, now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, we have to thank first Pablo and Jessica for structuring a very good panel. I think the presentation fit together very well. The title of the session is Reparation and Restitution. I'm a lawyer, so in law we used to talk about compensation and just money. So the concept has evolved to the reparation and restitution that all of you are talking about. I think everything fits really well. First, I'm going to start for Nina. The title I saw in the program is Territory as a Victim. Wow. I mean, normally victims are people, but I think the future is with you. I mean, nothing is more universal than the environment. I mean, it's maybe the challenge we're facing as humankind to protect the planet. Only if we protect the environment, we people are going to have real human rights. I mean, because it's the platform. I mean, it's the place we live, right? I think that the approach is very, very encouraging. I mean, you did it very well. In the other paper, Sara Leocandia, they talk about two things: extractivism, so extracting minerals, and something different. It's spoiling indigenous art. It seems that they're really different, but in fact, they share the same essence. It's a very innovative way of putting stuff. Also, when we talk about colonialism, we talk about Spain, England, Belgium, France. What happened with Germany? I mean, also, I mean, every country has a dark past. The thing is, with this extractivism, you're right. I mean, we are destroying land, environment. But with spoiling indigenous art, we're destroying people and their culture. And in the case of indigenous people, they are very close together. I think only doing these two things, we are going to have an integral reparation, really. Your paper was some kind of breakthrough for me. I mean, when I was reading, I said, what? They're talking about different things. Two different things. It's two papers. No, it's one. The paper, the Melanie's paper, also I enjoyed a lot. I mean, she's talking about Colombia. Colombia is at the center of transitional justice, neo-constitutionalism, and I think you grasp very well the whole process. I mean, when you talk about restitution of indigenous territory, you're also talking about something in a very integral way. I mean, the link between indigenous people and territories, it's more spiritual. They don't feel it in the same way that Westerners feel it. I mean, yeah, if especially people like us, I mean, academics that travel around, I mean, some of us don't have a very strong link with any place, but with indigenous people, it's different. And there is something spiritual there. I think, I mean, the research focus on Colombia going to give a lot of results, and your paper is basically that. I mean, I'm looking forward to see the complete version. Gemma, indigenous justice. I don't know what you think, but in my case, if I think about a virtue that a judge has to possess in order to adjudicate with fairness, is empathy. I mean, just putting, I mean, wearing the hat of other people, or wearing their shoes, depending on the country you are, right? Only understanding these parties, I mean, we are gonna give a fair adjudication. And I think this studying indigenous justice in many ways, I believe you're getting that. I'm not saying that the system of justice in Western countries or the colonial powers is bad. is basically we have to be open to see what happened in other systems. In indigenous people, I mean, the link between justice and environment is also very close. They understand justice as balance. They have a very, I would say, with intuition, they understand ecosystems and justice in general. And I think it's your research is extremely promising. I mean, I'm looking forward also to see the paper. I have studied a little about indigenous justice in Latin America, but you have a very wide approach. And the last paper that I didn't read, but Clement was about to talk about urban environment. I don't know where he's going to do it, but we people live in cities, so I think it's a very important approach too. If we have time, I would like to more than that. I mean, I'm very happy about the panel. I really enjoy each paper and the presentations. Also, the Pueblos were really good with a very nice picture, very engaging, very involving. But I would like to give a little more space for debate and questions from the public. That I see the room very full.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. So I think we can follow the same order that you followed when you presented. Answer? No? No?
No, I think we open for discussion.
Yeah, okay. Directly? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, questions? Any questions?
Otherwise, I have fulfilled this question. Denied.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to the question. So I have a question for you. So I'm actually more interested in discussing that. But I was wondering how you deal with the fact, I mean, with the critique that often indigenous justice is reduced to restorative justice when it's often a combination, like there is not really a distinction. Of course, there's an emphasis in restorative that we don't have in our criminal system, but they have both kind of combined. And so how do you handle this? Because often when I was speaking with indigenous, they were like, "Oh yeah, we said restorative justice about our system, not only restorative, and we also want a word to say in other things." So that would be like my question to you. And then I had a question about your paper, but maybe it's because we didn't have time and I didn't read the paper. So I don't know if, but I understood the two case study and then the frameworks. And I was wondering how you are linking it at the level of reparation and restitution, in the sense that I understand that both are about colonial legacy extractivism, but I see two very different cases, that one potentially fit way better into restitution question than the other. And as a matter of fact, when you present the normative framework, there is a normative framework about like healthy environment and so on that I could see very well in the first case, but not on the other. So I was just wondering, what is the link between those two cases, behind obviously the colonial extractivism, but also on the reparative measures? Like, is there a common reparative measure to this, or it's like different framework that are mobilized? So those were my question. Thank you.
It's self-government and self-determination.
I mean, you do not like my question.
Yes, I will have one question. I will try to speak English to be indulgent. One question to Nina. Once you spoke about reparaciones ecocentristas.
Yeah, greening reparation or ecocentric reparation.
Yeah, and so I will wonder what are the demands that the NASA people can have formulate to the jet, to the head. Instead of this one. So, you have a critic of this one, but what are the alternative and what would be a proper reparation in their vision? What you could have seen
based
in
on
the
the
film.
Yeah.
Okay, should we go to
Yeah, well, I mean, we have that, we can engage in.
Okay.
Exciting.
If I have to respond to your question, Nina, I appreciate it very much. So the thing is that, I mean, this is a question also in terms of human rights, not to get to, I think we have also, I listened in a presentation not to have an idealistic or romanticized vision of also of indigenous communities. And then the question is, again, are there marginalized communities or individuals within indigenous communities? And how do we deal with the question of power? And I do agree, and I think, so we're talking about the relationship with ecosystems. I don't want to use the term environment, which is very legal. Ecosystems or nature, I don't like it either. So there is a question here. But and I do think that we can still see what happens. But what is interesting is to see why the states, in terms of legal pluralism, they, with tensions, accept so the law system sometimes of indigenous communities for their own the crimes committed among them. But they are much more, they don't accept it for other kind of conflicts. They don't put the resources for that. It's like, okay, restorative justice you manage in your communities, but then in relation to crimes against the environment or harms, we use the notion of harm because there are things that are not criminalized and they're still important. They don't put the resources for restorative justice. It seems like, you know, they like the idea of the resonance of restorative justice and the principles within the conflicts in the indigenous communities. But when you put it in another scale, where the aggressors or where the harm doers are corporations, particularly big corporations, or the state, or with the connivance of the state, they are not so happy with the thing of restorative justice. So there is a question of scales. And I think we should not idealize indigenous justice, and we should not idealize restorative justice.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
In terms of your question to our paper, I would say it's very important when we talk about reparations. So there's often so much lost in translation because we have reparations as a movement. I think this is something very, very important as well. And then we have reparations as a legal consequence of a wrongful act, as a crime, like for a crime under the ICC reparation judgment system, so forth. And I think this is very important to distinguish and to keep that in mind. What we are doing there, and we are coming from a human rights strategic litigation standpoint. So we are working, for instance, with Chief Tucker on these cases, and real case under German constitutional law, which is also a decolonial reparative justice moment, because normally these sort of questions are framed only as a moral question, as a policy question, as something of ethics, and to frame it as law is already a reparative moment, because it was exactly through the colonial international law that legal subjectivity was negated to the indigenous communities in the territories. And so what we're doing is we are developing reparative legal practices that sort of oscillate between theory and praxis. And the theory is very, very present in this paper because we are showing through this concept of transtemporal colonial continuity how these type of restitution or extractivism, so to speak, because the second one is not a restitution case, obviously, but the way how these structures are the same and the structural racism in it is the same. How this creates a colonial continuity that needs to be confronted through law and through a decolonial legal praxis of legal interpretation and argumentation. And we're keeping it within the confines of the positive law because it's a strategic choice in a way, because it's a language that works. But obviously we need always to go back, and this is oscillating between theory and praxis. And I really like the last in your presentation, the one to do with fitting it in, stretching it out. But it's a strategic point in a way. And then I think when you do human rights strategic litigation, you can do a lot around the cases. You have the case, and you can make arguments in the court, and you need to stay within the confines of the law. But then outside the court, you can use art. I mean, this is all where all these moments of reparative or restorative justice can come in. Yes, I think this is where we're coming from, but yes, I'll put it at that.
And I will maybe ask, thank you for your question, actually. I actually mentioned more. It's also complex because, well, as you know, people have maybe heard of me, but like territory has a different, so like I don't want to undermine that there is also a physical dimension to territory. It doesn't mean that it's only like integral. I mean, it's also, so you have the spiritual aspect, but it's also the land, the territorialidad, or el territorio. And so there is also demand, of course, of more traditional reparation on sense of restitution, compensation, collective, but also individual. And then you have the grassroots and the political organization. So indeed, in Muchica, they will very much ask the state to be supportive with those healing process, kind of disarmonías. And then those require like performing rituals that are demanding actually money also to buy the thing, to go through the territory, identify with the spiritual leader exactly where are the bodies, how we address el sucio, how to levantar el sucio, and so on. And then at the, I would say, the political level, because now within the HEP, they have this possibility of having reparation to the territory and reparation to the communities. And initially they were like developing it together, but then they kind of understood that strategically, it will be maybe interesting to think to reparation to the territories that are more focused on the derecho propio. And then you have kind of a different process articulated by the lawyer and the organization. But so far I understood that at the political level, there may be trying something different than restitution at the level of reparation to the territory. Then it's different when they go for collective reparation about the communities. Because they saw an opening also on this territory as a victim of having something different there. So again, I mean, you know well the NASA. There is also like, I think, a difference when you speak to the communities in the territory directly and on the strategical, political, legal that are carried out by the organization. I don't know that kind of reply, but we can discuss further.
Yeah. If I, yes, just, and then I think that we have to talk about also from a legal view, the many reparation, so restitution for losses. There are sometimes things that, I mean, the ecosystems have, they have this capacity to regenerate, maybe in a time period that is more than human, of course. Sometimes restitution is not possible to go back to the place that it was.
Exactly.
So then we have this question, and we are in the United Nations, I know, maybe another word, United Nations Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. I'm saying this because you can find also scholarships in relation to this. It's the whole UN Decade. But there are many ways of reparation that can complement each other. There is symbolic reparation. Apologies, asking for forgiveness, and I know indigenous communities I was telling there are some indigenous communities that ask for forgiveness to also the land, but also from the state. And so there is symbolic reparation, there is material reparation, if so economic. There are also ways of doing education. There is also reparation through providing funds. So there are many ways, and we also have to be creative in that sense, also within law, sometimes outside.
may I ask one question on that one? Because for me it would be, and I think you had it in your presentation, but you hadn't had the time to address it. So when we talk about restorative justice and corporations, you were saying obviously they will never submit to it because it's. But then, through, for instance, like provisions or statutes like the German Legal Supply Chain Act. There you could enter a phase where you're even in civil laws litigation, and then there is a moment where the court could initiate negotiations, court agreement, and so forth. And I was always thinking, if you want to think about, especially in climate cases, about how to integrate reparations into the legal system, and because wouldn't that be a way?
Yes,
to push for that?
Yes, I'll send you a paper, and we saw all this again. Compliance. So in the paper is the same. The law in the paper and the law, the experience law, the compliance programs and the social, the corporate social responsibility, that now there is a new directive, for example, and it gets also, I think Germany has gone far more than the European Union directive, but you can integrate. So there are some elements that are there and let's not be naive either. I think within this strategic litigation and the use of law, we can think that there is this kind of a stick and carrot, and then there is this thing that many corporations are afraid of. Well, they have reputational fears, they have legal fears, they have also financial fears. Maybe it's not an ethical and a conviction word might allow setting them on the table. I always say that we have to do restorative encounters with corporations outdoors, outside the table, because they manage very well the table. We have to go to the traumatic spaces, and we have lawyers, facilitators, and so on. But yes, I agree with you. They are like entry points, difficult, but entry points where I do think we can reinterpret it in a more ecological and indigenous way. So.
And we will finish on an agreement. So, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.